the more I kind of get into crayfish, the more I find them really, really fascinating, really, really interesting, and learning that crayfish are really part of the culture here in the South and in Mississippi, and they're in our day-to-day lives. And so oftentimes when I talk to people about crayfish or crawfish, we'll get to that in a second, people often think, oh, how many species are there? One or two? No, there's a lot more than that. We'll get to that. So we're going to be talking a little bit about diversity, a little bit about conservation of crawfish, a little bit about their biology and their life history today. But let's start with, what do you call these things? What do you call the miniature lobster, one that you find in lakes and streams? This was a question that was asked by Josh Katz out of North Carolina State in 2013. He was studying linguistics and really wanted to learn what certain words people call what around the U.S. And so if you look at the map, in the red, a lot of people down here call them crawfish. If you're from Arkansas, you might call them crawdads. If you're from Minnesota like me, you might call them crayfish, right? So we got a lot of terms for these animals, and there's a lot more too. We've got freshwater lobsters, craw crabs, mud bugs. I like ditch crickets a lot. Yabbies, that's in Australia. Krebs, langostino. Ecrevis is a Cajun term, I believe, if I pronounce that right. And then chacchuma, which is actually the name of a tribe of Native Americans here in Mississippi, and actually translates to red crawfish, which is really, really cool. So who's correct? Who wins this battle? There's lots of terms for these animals. You might be pretty confused like Calvin and Hobbes here. But the saying, I like to use is that crawfish is what you eat, crayfish is what you study, and crawdads are what you catch in the creek. Really, no one's wrong here, all right? But I'll probably say crawfish and crayfish throughout this presentation. So today, what are we going to cover? We're going to cover biodiversity of crayfish, crayfish anatomy, a little bit on that, biology, ecology, some of the threats that crayfish face, and what are some recent conservation actions that Mississippi Museum of Natural Science and Department of Wildlife, what are we doing for these animals? And the goal is really I want you guys to gain an appreciation for crayfish, their role in the ecosystem, and have a better understanding of what we do here to conserve these species in the state of Mississippi. So starting with the global biodiversity of crayfish, there's about 700 species on the planet here. 6 out of 7 continents have a species of crayfish. The most diverse areas are in the United States, up here, and then down here in Australia. So crayfish come in all different kinds of shapes and sizes. We have these dwarf crayfishes. These are the second smallest crayfish species here on the planet. We have about 20 species native to North America. They're pretty small. They could probably sit on the head of a quarter. They live only about a year or two, compared to the largest crayfish, which is the Tasmanian giant freshwater crayfish, a super cool crayfish. It's actually the world's largest freshwater invertebrate as well, native Tasmania. They're really long-lived, and they grow to about 10 to 15 pounds. So to put that into perspective, it would take about 6 red swamps to equal about 1 pound of crawfish, right? But it would take about 60 of those red swamps to equal 1 Tasmanian crayfish. And that's pretty incredible. That's quite the boil if you just had one crayfish, one Tasmanian crayfish. Imagine that. So crayfish actually come in all kinds of different variations in color and pattern. What you might typically see are these red or these browns, but they actually come in different shades of red: white, blue, brown, orange, and purple, and they have different stripes and patterns, and even saddles. And crayfish have some really awesome names. Things like the Crawzilla crawdad, the hillbilly hairy crayfish, the bluegrass crayfish, and some in Mississippi, the lame crayfish, the ambiguous crayfish, and one of my favorite, the lonesome gravedigger, which just sounds like a monster truck. So looking at the second most diverse hotspot for crayfish, right, Australia. They have about 170 species. They call them yabbies. They are in a completely different family than what we have here in the States. They're similar, but they have a little bit different body design, spines, claw shapes a little bit different. You can notice this one has really little beady little eyes, pretty odd. And some of these crayfish, like over here on the left, are actually used in the pet trade, and they grow them so that they have different kinds of crazy coloration. So, North American crayfish diversity. We have 450 different crayfish here in North America. The southeast United States alone supports 55% of the world's crayfish diversity in this region of the U.S. If you were to go to west of the Rocky Mountains, you would find less than 10 native crayfish species out there. And in the southeast, we generally have one family here, Camberidae. When we're looking at Mississippi and some of its regional states, we have the highest amounts of crayfish. Sometimes Alabama has 99, 100 crayfish species. In Mississippi, we've got the fourth highest diversity. We got 67 species, and 13 of these species are found nowhere else. They're only found in the state of Mississippi. And some of these crayfish, like the Camp Shelby burrowing crayfish, are really, really small ranges. They're only found, this species here is only found in the DeSoto National Forest area, around the Camp Shelby military confinement area. Crayfish diversity in Mississippi mirrors crayfish diversity in color around the world. We have arguably some of the prettiest and coolest looking crayfish out there. Some of my favorites, the Jackson Prairie crayfish, we'll talk about that later. We've got the banded mudbug, one of my favorites, one of the first species I worked with, and then the painted hand mudbug, which might be our newest species to this day. Really pretty, different colors. Yeah. Moving on to crayfish anatomy. We'll make this quick and try to make it straightforward. But what is a crayfish? Let's start there, right? A crayfish is an aquatic arthropod. It has a segmented body, has a hard exoskeleton, and has jointed appendages. They are in the order Decapoda, meaning 10-footed. They are related to crabs and shrimps and lobsters. They differ a little bit, specifically from lobsters, that crayfish are found in freshwater. They're not found in marine environments. They have a different claw shape. Lobsters have these crusher claws and these shredder claws. And then lobsters actually have this, some lobsters have a larval stage that kind of looks like an alien spaceship, whereas a crayfish just has direct development. It looks like a little crayfish when it's young and it grows up to a big crayfish. So when it comes to identifying crayfish species, they can be pretty difficult to identify. Like I said, there's not a lot of classes, there's not a lot of people teaching about crayfish. Regional textbooks are far and few in between. And there are sometimes very subtle differences between crayfish. You know, I might hand someone two separate looking crayfish and they're going to say, oh, that's the same thing. That's not always the case. And so even people who study crayfish have a hard time identifying crayfish. And this is also due to crayfish lose their color. If you preserve a crayfish in ethanol, which is what we do, they tend to lose their color over time. They all just kind of get this yellow-orange color. Looking at crayfish anatomy, there's two major regions, the cephalothorax, which consists of the head, and the thorax. This is also called the carapace. And then you have the abdomen, which is the tail. When it comes to identifying crayfish, there's lots of different traits you can use and look at, but I just want to kind of focus on some of the most important, in my opinion, are things like the chile, the claws, the rostrum, so part of the face. You have the areola, which is these lines here on the carapace, as well as the reproductive organ of the crayfish. It's really important. As well as color pattern, and I want to specify color pattern and not just color, in that this is the same species actually, but they come in different kinds of variations of color. You can have a dark-looking red swamp crayfish, you can have a light-looking red swamp crayfish, but it's still the same thing. But what you need to focus on is the color pattern. So you have dark claws with a lighter tubercle or a bump on the claw on all three of these crayfish. You also have this kind of black triangle along the tail. So those are kind of for example, that's kind of what you need to be looking for color pattern. And I want to talk a little bit about blue crawfish. You guys have probably heard about blue crawfish, that they're really rare, right? If you find them at a boil, you know, it's one in a million you find a blue crayfish. However, here's just an example. This is the same species here. This is a war paint mudbug. My friends here just brought in one that they caught. And so these crayfish, for example, can turn blue just from genetic mutation, or they can also, if you have one as a pet, they can also just turn blue because of some dietary deficiency. Yeah. But also, some crayfish species are just blue, right? Some of the key characteristics and some of the variation you might see in crayfish. You have some crayfish, the rostrum, so we're looking at the face part of the crayfish. Some are rounded, Some are more pointed at the end, and some have this long acumen with spines on either side. Looking at the claws, okay? Some of them are shorter and stubbier, some of them are thicker, some are skinnier, some have more bumps than others, and some even have hairs, dense patches of hairs along the claw. This is actually called a beard. Kind of funny. But you need to watch out for regeneration of these chelae because this is on the right-hand side, crayfish can actually regrow different parts of their body. And on the right-hand side, this is a normal-looking claw that the crayfish is born with. But if it loses a claw over time, it's going to grow back usually something like this now. So they're going to invest a bunch of energy into that appendage to get it to regrow again, but they're not going to try to put in a bunch of effort to making it look ornamental like it was the first time, because they need to grow that claw back as quickly as possible in order to defend themselves or to catch prey. Another key character is the areola variation you might see along the carapace of the crayfish, so right here. So they can either be obliterated, meaning they're touching, or they can be narrow, or they can be quite large. So over on the left-hand side, these are crayfish with obliterated areolas. These are generally our burrowing crayfish. We'll talk about that in a little bit, some of our terrestrial burrowing crayfish. And then these crayfish with open areolas are generally freshwater, stream-dwelling, river-dwelling crayfish. Also differentiating between the crawdaddies and the crawmamas here, we've got males here on the left, males and females on the right. Males tend to be larger in size, they have larger chelae, they have narrow abdomens. Females are generally smaller in size, generally have smaller chelae, and have wider abdomens because they actually attach their young to their abdomens, and I'll talk about that in a second. Looking at their reproductive organs, so right here on the left you have the male, and so what I'm pointing at here is actually the second pleopods, and behind that is the male gonopod. These are stalk-like structures. They're two appendages. They're rather long, and then you have and come in different kinds of shapes, sizes. I'll show you that in a second. And then on the right, you have the female annulus ventralis. This is a pocket-like structure, and so these two reproductive organs function as a lock and key. And so when it comes to one species, a particular species might have a particular gonopod that is only going to function, and you're only going to be able to reproduce with a female or a species of the opposite sex. So there's not a whole lot of hybridization here in crayfish. And so what I might point out here is this is what the gonopods kind of look like. These are really important when it comes to identifying what species you have. When these species were described, oftentimes they are described based on the shape of the male gonopod. Here's just a different variety of the gonopods you might see. Some are hooked and some are a little bit longer. And this is just a portion of what they kind of look like. There's a whole different kinds of different shapes and sizes. When it comes to respiration, how do crayfish breathe? So crayfish actually extract oxygen through feather-like gills that are similar to fish. You can see here in red, these are the gills. They're actually able to extract oxygen through the air as long as their gills maintain moisture. And this is really important when it comes to some of our semi-terrestrial burrowing crayfish that actually live underground. This is very, very important. And we'll talk about these burrowing crayfish here in just a little bit. All right, moving on to biology and their life history. Okay. So here's just a real generalized life cycle of crayfish. They can be a little bit more complex than this, but crayfish, depending on species, may reproduce within that first year of life. Sometimes it might be a year, sometimes it might be a year and a half. Some species reproduce year-round, while some only produce one time per year, and stream-dwelling crayfish generally live 2 to 3 years, while these burrowers, maybe 5, I don't know, we don't really know. There's not like this is kind of an open-ended question. Cave crayfish live a lot longer. They can sometimes live 20 or 30 species, or 20 or 30 years. But these burrowers we have here in Mississippi, we're not exactly sure the age of these critters. But in the fall, this is usually the period of courtship and reproduction. Males are equipped with lots of different structures to actually attach themselves and grab a hold of a female. The chelae are really important in reproduction because that's how the male grafts the female. If it doesn't have chelae, it's going to have a hard time reproducing. Females can mate with multiple males, and actually the females will store sperm until they're ready to fertilize those eggs, sometimes weeks or months later. In the late winter and spring, that's when the female, the craw mamas, begin to fertilize those eggs. And the eggs actually attach to the abdomen of the crayfish on the underside of the tail. And so these crayfish actually grow up into what we call craylings, which are just small little mini crayfish. So when they hatch from the egg, they stay attached to the mother. And the mother actually aerates those young with her tail to keep them alive. But these little craylings in the springtime eventually drop off. Here's a little baby crayfish. And in the spring they're released. This is probably the most vulnerable stage of crayfish life history. If you can imagine, you're quite small, your claws are pretty tiny, you're not going to be able to defend yourself, you're going to be able to be eaten pretty easily. But they try to grow as quickly as possible. And what I want to mention here is these little small crayfish, and before that first year of life, these small crayfish are non-reproductive, and we classify that as a Form 2 individual. And so, I'll talk about that in 1 second here. In the summer, and in that first year of life, crayfish, the young grow really quickly, like I said. They can sometimes molt 6 to 10 times during that period, during that summer period, because they're growing. This is kind of what that molt might look like. In their adult years, they might just shed 1 or 2 times. And this is also a very vulnerable time for them because they're kind of soft when they molt. So when I was talking about that Form 2 versus Form 1, so this is, again, we're looking at the male gonopods here. So when a crayfish, particularly it's just a male crayfish, reaches sexual maturity, and it's the breeding season, they undergo a cyclic dimorphism, so just meaning they kind of change back and forth. So that crayfish that was reproductively inactive, it was a Form 2 male, now it molts and it becomes a Form 1 male. So then on the right-hand side is an example of a Form 2 gonopod. On the left-hand side is an example of a Form 1 gonopod. So they go from really kind of globular and misshapen, and then they go to more keratinized and more kind of delicate in their structure. And these are really important. So when you're collecting crayfish, it's important that also, hopefully you get lucky and you get a Form 1 male, because that is really important in identifying what species you're looking at. Looking at the ecology and behavior of these critters. So here's a video of a burrowing crayfish that I actually took. This is a digger crayfish, Crustaceans phodians. It's brown in coloration, sometimes can be blue. Has these really large, intimidating claws that they actually use to scoop up mud from the bottoms of their burrows, and they'll bring it up to the tops and kind of start making these chimneys, these mounds you've probably seen before. I think that's pretty cute, little guy there. So, not all crayfish live in rivers and streams and lakes and ponds. A lot of them actually, there's about 25 species that live underground and only live underground. So when we talk about burrowing crayfish, there's generally 3 different classifications or bins we like to put them in. So one is a primary burrower. These are crayfish that are really adapted to living in groundwater. So there's actually water underneath the surface of the ground in most cases. This can fluctuate depending on the season, but these crayfish hardly ever come to the surface. They live in these, ant kind of tunnels that they make, and they never really come to the surface. So they're really secretive, hard to study. This is an example of a species that might live in a pitcher plant bog. These are like Crustaceans species, and they make these horizontal-like structures that often are kind of complex. Compared to another type of primary burrower, which are like these prairie-dwelling crayfish that live in these really unique habitats, but they might just make one tunnel straight down, or they might make a tunnel straight down and then have like a alternative escape plan on the side, sometimes 2 or 3 openings. A secondary burrower is a really odd kind of critter. These creatures kind of live in these wetland areas, these depressional areas where there's standing water for periods of their life. So when it's dry and the water table is deep, these are the months of May through August. The crayfish will make chimneys, they'll burrow underground, and they'll live in that water table, right? But in the wet months, maybe January through May, these critters actually come to the surface, and you'll find them in pockets of surface water, and they'll actually kind of commingle and forage and defend territory and mate during this period. And then lastly, there's a tertiary burrower. These are crayfish that live in streams, rivers, and these are probably the typical crayfish you're familiar with. The red swamps are an example, where they live in streams, permanent water bodies all year round. So all crayfish can burrow, but these tertiary burrows, these crayfish that live in streams, will only burrow if there's a drought. If that stream dries up, they're going to find a log to go under, they're going to find a rock to go under, and they're going to live under there until the water returns. What I think is really interesting is how in the environment shapes the body design of these different creatures. So you've got a stream-dwelling crayfish on the left-hand side. There's a shrimp crayfish. It's only found in streams and rivers. And then on the right-hand side, you've got a semi-terrestrial burrowing crayfish. It's a Crustaceans species. It's kind of a bog-loving species. And so on the left, you have these stream dwellers. They have these really strong, powerful tails to swim and swim away from predation. And then they oftentimes have these kind of thinner, more elongate claws. The burrowing crayfish, however, have these thicker, stout bodies and these thicker claws to kind of help them move mud. And they also have kind of vestigial reduced tail that doesn't really function much other than the females, that's where they store their young. A few other things is that these stream dwellers often have more of a flattened body, so they can go under rocks, they can go under vegetation. They usually have larger eyes, so they can see predators. And then these burrowing crayfish usually have beadier, smaller eyes, and a more compressed body, so that they actually don't have to dig as much. So what good are crayfish, you might ask? Well, they're good in a lot of different ways. They're really, really, really important for food web dynamics. Crayfish are like this perfect link between aquatic systems and terrestrial systems. You've got so many critters that venture into an aquatic system like crayfish. You've got some snakes, hellbenders. Their diet is almost entirely crayfish. Young alligators depend on crayfish. These crowned night herons, most of their diet is crayfish. So they're really, really important as a food source. As well as crayfish are great decomposers. The kind of saying goes is everything eats crayfish, and crayfish in return eat everything. So they kind of get the last laugh here. If something dies, they're going to eat it. They're going to eat vegetation, and they're going to eat other insects. They're really, really diverse in their eating habits. They're also keystone species. Burrowing crayfish provide really critical habitat for the survival of a lot of species, including some of the amphibians and reptiles we have here in the state of Mississippi. Things like the crawfish snake feed on crawfish, but also burrow into the ground. The crawfish frog we'll talk about that in a little bit, depends on the burrows of crawfish for its survival. And then you've got, I don't believe the Heinz emerald dragonfly is in Mississippi, but in some of the northern regions, it actually plants its larvae in the burrows of crayfish. And so you will only have these particular species if you've got burrowing crayfish. And also, crayfish are really beneficial for plant growth. They can aerate soils and provide nutrients that are really important to some of our pitcher plants that we have here in Mississippi. Also, crayfish are part of our human culture, right? And they oftentimes venture into our arts and our hobbies. There's actually old Greek currency with crayfish on coins and sculptures. And this is a friend of mine, Pat, who likes to dress up as a crawfish. I'm not going to go that far, but and then there's this awesome comic book I realized. Louisiana's superhero, Crawfish Man, was a comic from the 1970s. I've never heard of this. Maybe Marvel can adapt this, and it'll be a movie one day. Also, I don't have to tell you guys this. Crawfish are found in our food and our recreation. Through these crawfish boils, we like to call them. They're really important to our local economy in Mississippi, but also in Louisiana. There's about 2,300 fishermen and farmers that depend on crawfish for their everyday survival and depending on getting finances. There's about 100 million pounds of crawfish are produced in Louisiana, and that's about 300 million to the state's economy. There's also, I realized that there's these European crayfish parties called Crawfish, and it's a Nordic tradition going back to the 1500s. Europe has some crayfish species, and these are boiled in ale, and and dill apparently, and then they're served cold. So completely opposite to what we do. Someone's gonna have to try that and tell me how that tastes. But also fishing. If you like to fish, one of the most common things used is either you put a crawfish on a hook, or there's all these different lures and flies that people use to try to mimic the crayfish found in their local streams. And then just the youthful fascination. I'll do summer camps with kids, and kids love crayfish. I know I did when I was a kid, setting minnow traps like this, and they love to pick them up. They love to see you get pinched by a crayfish. And they're just a really great tool to teach kids about aquatic systems. Moving on to our last two sections, so we had habitats and then recent conservation actions. Habitats, where do you find crayfish? Crayfish are everywhere in the state. So this is some records from the database we have here at the museum. And so you can see crayfish are anywhere, and this is underrepresented. Crayfish are literally everywhere. They're one of the most dominant freshwater organisms on the planet. What does this habitat look like? It's pretty diverse. So you might be more familiar with some of these habitats, these aquatic habitats. This is the Pearl River. They're found there. They're found in these beautiful clear streams we have in southern Mississippi, in some of our wetlands and our floodplains of these rivers. They're also found in oxbows. They're found in ditches, and I've seen some crayfish in caves. We don't have any cave species here in the state, but I've seen some crayfish that kind of venture their way into these caves we have here in the state. And then crayfish, these burrowing crayfish, occupy lots of different terrestrial habitats. Would it be these pitch plant bogs or remnant prairie habitats we have in the Jackson Prairie ecosystem, even in deforested areas. I've seen them in ag fields, even in people's front yards and their gardens. I've actually had people call me and say, hey, I got crayfish in my garden. Can you come out here and help me out? And so crayfish, what are the requirements? Well, I got 2 degrees in aquatic biology, and one of the first things I learned is that these aquatic organisms, they need water, okay, first to live, but they need diverse habitats. They need aquatic vegetation, and they need large woody debris that they oftentimes hide in or try to break down and eat. And then these burrowing crayfish oftentimes need open canopy habitats and intact floodplains. What are the threats to crayfish? Obviously, habitat loss is a huge concern. So when we alter hydrology, when we drain these wetlands, when we try to get water off the landscape, whether they're draining in egg fields or putting in concrete ditches, that's a negative to crayfish. Sedimentation, when we are having erodible banks that fall into our creeks and our streams that fill in our rocks, our interstitial spaces, that's not good for crayfish. They don't have a place to hide, they don't have a place to forage. And then fire suppression, as we've kind of grown and expanded, we've kind of limited fire on the landscape. And so now we have increase in understory growth, and crayfish need open habitats. When you have lots of leaf litter, crayfish don't like that. And then impervious surfaces, again, just kind of eliminating water from the landscape, funneling it off, and that's not good for crayfish either. And so we also have some blame, and just physically we've tried to eradicate some crayfish species. So sometimes they're known as pests, right? When you run them over with your lawnmower, the mounds, or sometimes they've destroyed crops. And so in 1932, actually, there's a group of farmers that requested the Mississippi Ag Experimental Station to develop control measures to eradicate species of crayfish we have here in the state. This was actually some of our very beginning knowledge on crayfish happened in 1937 by Clay Lyle. I'm not going to read you all of this, but this is part of the text from here. And he states, Mississippi is almost unique in possessing the only crawfish in the United States which frequently causes wholesale destruction of major farm crops. They often ruin entire crops of cotton and corn in a single night in the black prairie soils of northeast Mississippi. These burrow mounds built by the crawfish and meadows are serious obstacles to mowing machines. And so this is actually from his thesis, an old photograph of people walking around and poisoning the burrows, trying to eradicate crayfish from their fields. And this is an example of a mound that looks like. Pretty sad. Some other threats we're concerned about: invasive species and disease. So bait bucket introductions are kind of common. You know, if you're going fishing, you might bring a crayfish from the Pearl, and then you're going to go fishing down in the Pascagoula, and then when you're done with the day, you're going to dump those crayfish out. Well, sometimes those crayfish aren't found in the Pascagoula. They're only found in the Pearl, so when you release them, that can be a problem. We don't have any invasive crayfish in Mississippi yet. That is a positive. But in other regions, up in the north, the rusty crayfish is a big problem, destroys a bunch of vegetation, outcompetes natives. The red claw crayfish is an Australian crayfish that was, it's in the pet trade, and it was released, and it's actually been found in Texas. It's a pretty large and intimidating crayfish, burrows into the ground as well. And then the red swamp, our native crayfish, is actually invasive in the U.S. in some regions, but throughout the world. This is one of the most common and ubiquitous species of aquatic animals in the world. It's been spread around everywhere, dating back to the 1920s. And so disease is another thing. In Europe, they hardly have any crayfish left anymore. That's part of the reason why red swamp crayfish have been spread around so much, is that there's this thing called crayfish plague. It was actually introduced from our U.S. native crayfish. And it's actually, that plague has kind of, if it gets into a water body in Europe, it pretty much eradicates all their native species. And so that's a really big problem. It isn't in the U.S. quite yet, but if it gets here, it's probably over for our natives. So what are we doing here at the museum and at MDWFP? Well, before we begin there, I want to start with, what do you call a person who studies crayfish? So the study of crayfish is asticology, and the Greek term astakos actually means little lobster. And so when you're spelling this word, it's kind of a long, scary word, but it's really important that you spell it with one S and not two S's. So who are some of the most important people through the history of crayfish here in Mississippi? Who do we contribute a lot of our knowledge to? This dates back to Joe Fitzpatrick. He actually described, he was a professor at University of Alabama, described 13 species here in the state, and produced two comprehensive lists of a complete list of, what do we have in the state? What do we have in Mississippi? And it has a crayfish called the spiny-tailed crayfish, Procambus Fitzpatrick, named after him. Paul Hartfield, he's usually at these meetings. I think he's in Oregon right now, but he was a former museum zoologist. He kind of started the collection in the 1970s. And then moved to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and he was really responsible for developing a lot of our earliest assessments of what species is rare and what ones do we need to be concerned about. He has a crayfish called Faxonius hartfieldi, the yazoo crayfish, named after him. And then we have Bob Jones. He was my predecessor, curator of decapods. He served at the museum for a long, long time, and he's really, really responsible for the shape that the collection's in, and the growth and the identification of a lot of the species we have in the collection. He as well has a crayfish named after him, Sukunuchi river crayfish, Faxonius jonesi. And lastly, Susie. Susie is one of my close collaborators. She works up in Oxford as an ecologist with the Forest Service, and she's been here since 2000. She's amazing. She's put out 18 publications on Mississippi crayfish, and her work has really been fundamental in adding 8 species to the state, as well as describing 2 new species that no one ever knew about. So these people have really, like I said, contributed to our decapod collection. This is what we have here at the museum. We actually have a decapod collection here at Mississippi Museum of Natural Science. It's a repository for crayfish researchers here in Mississippi, but around the U.S. It's best represented, this collection is we've got crayfish, we've got shrimps, and we've got crabs, mostly crayfish. It's one of the largest state collections of crustaceans in North America. It's probably one of the largest collections of crayfish in the world. And these are super valuable resources. You know, I like to talk about museums as a library. They store vouchered specimens with a date, a collector, where was it collected. And this is like a book, right? You can rent these books out, and you can study them and learn more about a particular crayfish in a particular region. But these collections are really only useful when you can find them, right? And when you can't find a jar, it's somewhere. It's really confusing. You feel like SpongeBob running around looking for it. But thankfully, Bob and we've been the last few years really cleaning up this collection and making it really easily accessible for researchers. So looking at some of the numbers in this collection, the background, this is actually kind of what our database looks like. And what we can compile some numbers from there. We've got 10,000 jars of decapods in the collection. We've got almost 60,000 specimens, 144 paratypes, lots. These are like the holy grail of the crayfish world. They're really useful in identifying what species is what. And then we've got almost, when we're looking at just crayfish and just Mississippi, we've got about 6,500 jars. That's a really powerful tool. And so just kind of mapping this all out, crayfish are found in we have crayfish in the collection from 37 of our 50 states. Most of them are from Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. And we actually have crayfish from 16 other countries outside the U.S. However, crayfish are really historically understudied compared to something like the fish collection that has 100,000 jars in its collection, really impressive. Up until 2004, there were only less than 2,000 jars of crayfish in our collection. However, when Bob really started focusing on crayfish later in his career, he had about 4,000 lots of crayfish, doubling the collection in a short period of time. He collected a lot of crayfish, but also he identified a lot of historical specimens as well. And this work is really needed. There's been a fair amount of work on some of our aquatic species throughout the state, but some of our burrowing crayfish, there's a really lack of information. In some areas, large parts of the state, we have very little information on these creatures. And there's a lot of taxonomic work that is needed, so there will be new species that we will describe here in Mississippi in the coming years. We just need more people interested in studying them. So I want to talk a little bit about, well, how do you look for these things, especially these burrows? These are the ones I'm really passionate about. How do you do a survey, right? So it first begins in the months of May through October. We're kind of scouting. We're looking for crayfish burrows on the ground, and we'll take a regional approach or a species-specific approach and look for burrows in and around the known distribution of the species based on our collections at the museum. And we're actually able to create a potential sampling list, right? So we're driving around, there's a burrow, we're coming back to those. That last one, no burrows, no need to come back. And so we really start sampling in the months of January through May. The sampling, we really try to focus on the wet periods of Mississippi. So when the crayfish are higher up towards the tops of their burrows, it's a little bit easier to catch them. And we use stake flags that we put in the ditches or in the field and kind of shows to us where the burrows are. We are able to gather a measure of density of how many crayfish are there in a particular area. And sometimes one person can put down 60 flags in 5 minutes. So some of these areas can be really, really dense with crayfish. Here's Robbie, the ichthyologist on Muddy. So it's a muddy but really fun job. These crayfish, to get them out of their holes, we'll physically stick our hands down there and kind of rip at the soil, or use soil knives or shovels even if necessary. So we're kind of widening that hole and sticking our hand down there. And crayfish generally don't pinch you. Sometimes they will, but generally you're able to just grab your hand in there and kind of scoop them up. And if it's too deep, if it's a dry period, sometimes there's dry spells, we'll use tools like just a jug to fill up that tunnel so that crayfish can come to the surface, or we'll use these pumps that actually can suction the crayfish out of the ground and we'll kind of shoot them out. Really fun. So here's just an example. They can be really deep. These crayfish can sometimes be 10 feet deep. If they're that deep, we're probably not getting them. But here's an example of a crayfish kind of using a wait and see approach. We'll kind of tickle the water, get their curiosity going, and then they'll kind of come to the surface. I usually kind of the second time it comes up, I'm gonna go down and I'm gonna try to stand. And so you kind of got to be quick. Sometimes you don't always get them. This happens to be a Jackson prairie crayfish. I will talk about that one a little bit. I actually got it out of a cornfield. And so really cool species, but there it is. All right, so what have we been doing these last few years? This is the first project I was involved with, was looking for banded mudbugs and the lonesome gray digger. These are the two new species that Susie helped describe. Mael Glun was a PhD student. He was really imperative on describing these as well. And these species are only found in Mississippi, Alabama, and they're only found in Jackson, George County, which is in the very corner of the state along the coast. But we had a really limited understanding of their distribution and their habitat preferences. Where do these things like to live? And so we're like, hey, let's go look for them. We need that information. And in that report, that original description, it was stated that neither of these species, you're not going to find them west of the Pascagoula. They just didn't have time to look there, but they also presumed that that was a barrier. These crayfish just aren't going to move. And so with that information in mind, we went looking for them. We looked for the banded mudbug here. Here's where they're located. We found them actually at 11 new locations. So the bright red is where we found them. The pink is where they were historically known. And so we really didn't expand the species range much. It's very limited. We're actually concerned about this species. It has some threats facing it. There's saltwater intrusion and other things. But it's a really cool crayfish found in just one little ecoregion, one little pocket of Mississippi. Then we got the lonesome gravedigger, the crayfish with the great name. We found this one at 17 new sites in the dark blue. And what was really cool with this one is we were actually able to find it in the northern part of it, more north than it was ever documented before, and we actually were able to find it on the west side of the Pascagoula for the first time. So that's really important. If this species ever needs to get listed, if ever we think it's, hey, this species needs protection, there's information stating, hey, it's actually found in other areas than you would have previously have thought this habitat needs to be protected. In 2025, it was actually a really cool collaborative project. We worked with Will Selman and Millsaps. He and some of our biologists here at the Museum of Natural Science have been looking for crawfish frog these last few years, species we're really concerned about. And this crawfish frog only lives in the burrows of crawfish, burrowing crawfish. They live there out 11 months out of the year, and they only surface for 1 month out of the year to reproduce. And so we really wanted to understand, is there a relationship between the crawfish frog and the crayfish, burrowing crayfish found in that region? Is it one species that's important to the crawfish frog? So we visited 10 of the 18 known locations around the central Mississippi, Madison area, down here in Scott County as well. And here's a video. We were really, really lucky to be out there one night looking for crawfish, and we encountered, we're one of the first people to see this critter kind of alive in a long time. And so we're actually returning it to a crawfish burrow, and it's going back underground. So it's going to live under there. Yeah, really cool. So what did we find? We found digger crayfish, that crayfish that was making the chimneys and the mounds earlier. It's found at 10 out of all the sites we went to. We found this guy. Of all the sites we went to, we found the javelin crayfish, another common crayfish in the area, at 8 of those 10 sites. And then we found a Jackson prairie crayfish, which is a species of greatest conservation need. We'll talk about that one in a little bit, at 1 location. And this project was really important. We were able to establish a bunch of landowner relationships, telling people, hey, you got this really cool frog in your area. You got these really cool crayfish. This is something you need to be aware of, And we think it's really going to be useful information if we're trying to reintroduce crawfish frogs to areas that are, we think they might have historically been. We know that you need to have these critters around in order for the crawfish frog to do well there. So the Jackson prairie crayfish just completed this one. This was a species that was considered for listing under the Endangered Species Act. It's a species that is really notoriously difficult to collect. It's found really deep underground. It's found in these prairies in the Jackson Prairie, just east of Jackson. And it has these really cool beards along the claws that not a lot of crayfish have. They come really cool colors. And so we wanted to work with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to give them some updated information in order to make a better decision. Does this thing really need to be listed or not? And so, here's some of the results. It was really only at 14 locations in the Jackson Prairie ecoregion. But from our study, we found them at a total of 70 spots, including 47 new locations. This thing is one of the most common crayfish you're going to find in the Jackson Prairie ecoregion. But it doesn't mean it's not cool. It's a really freaking cool crayfish with these beards, and it's biology. And so what we really found is that these crayfish are found in really unique habitats. they live in these high elevations of these watersheds. So here's a watershed, right? We all live in watersheds. If rain falls within this circle, it's going to hit a creek, and it's going to flow downstream, and it's going to go into an ocean eventually. But these crayfish, these Jackson prairie crayfish, live in these unexpected areas. They live in the high hilltops at the nexus of where a stream's going to form. And so this is actually in the industrial portion of Pearl, kind of an aerial image. And so kind of what we started to key in on. And so in the dry months, it's just a field. But in following a rain event, it turns into a stream. And then we actually found crayfish, these burrowing Jackson prairie crayfish, walking around on the surface. We also maybe have a potential new species. This is kind of a little early to tell. But it looks a whole heck of a lot different than the Jackson prairie crayfish. Doesn't have the hairs, but we found them within the range, kind of near Peelhatchie. The last thing I want to talk about here is just the movement and behavior of some of these burrowing crayfish. So we don't have a lot of information, and when we're making these status assessments trying to determine if they're rare or not, and they're looking for life history information, well, there isn't really any. We don't know if they move, we don't know how often they move, when do they move, and so this is difficult for us. But we wanted to kind of take a look at, use some game cameras to kind of monitor their behavior a little bit. And so we've got this white bucket here with a game camera at the top, and it's actually on a tomato can that's positioned at the burrow entrance of a crayfish burrow. And you can see rain kind of started to happen on, was it May 6th, around 11 o'clock at night. And the rain kind of triggered this crayfish to open up its burrow, kind of peeked, kind of took a look around, what you see here in just a little bit. And so we're actually taking pictures every 3 minutes, and then we're able to look at this at a time lapse. So we've got a lot of photos to go through. But what you'll see is that the crayfish then opens up its hole again. This is kind of odd behavior to see it in the middle of the day making a burrow. Usually these are nocturnal animals. Kind of peeking, checking things out. Now it's kind of starting to get dark. And then it's going to start doing what the digger crayfish did. There's actually a young individual right down here as well. But it's going to start making a chimney. It's going to start making its mound. And so we don't exactly know why they do this. We think it maybe might be do something with kind of keeping moisture in the tunnel, or maybe attracting mates, just kind of sending pheromones out. But just kind of a cool, interesting. So cool, interesting behavior. We're going to learn a lot about these critters. And then we're also looking at when are there's a laser beam that goes through here. And so when that crayfish comes out of the hole, when there's lots and lots of rain, they'll actually kind of leave. And we're trying to figure out how far are they going, when are they coming back, how long are they staying out for, and what times of years are they actually on the surface. And so all this information we've been gathering in the last couple of years is really important. See here, here's me. In the last couple of years, we've added about 820 lots of crayfish to the museum's decapod collection. This is really important, up-to-date, new information for us to be able to make determinations on, are these crayfish rare or are they not rare? And this is really important. If maybe some of you guys maybe heard of Fanny Cook, she had her birthday just about last month. She was really imperative in kind of creating some of the collections here at the museum. And so it's really important that we continue to add collections to pre-existing museums. In fact, a lot of them are in decline. Just lack of funding at a lot of these universities, and so there's some ethical concerns as well. But if we fail to add to current existing museum collections, it's really going to compromise the value of our existing collections that we have now. We're going to have less knowledge and less ability to make inferences on populations. And so I'll just close with this. How can you guys contribute to ongoing crayfish research here in the state? Well, this is a cool tool, iNaturalist, if you're familiar with it. You can actually take photographs of the critters you find and then upload it. We actually have a Mississippi crayfish group where it automatically gets brought into this group. And I actually just went through, I didn't realize how cool this tool was, but went through and identified crayfish, and in the process of actually taking citizen science, right? Crayfish that y'all are finding out in the world, in the stream, or whatever, and actually trying to plot that and add that to our existing database as new occurrences. And we're actually finding some really cool records that people have been uploading. And then lastly, there's actually some some people out there, other agencies and such that promote, killing of burrowing crayfish, dumping poison down burrows. And I just think that's unnecessary. I know it's probably, a site. It's not fun to mow these mounds over, but they're really cool creatures. They're part of our ecosystem. I would just encourage anyone to, leave these things alone and appreciate them. And if you're really interested in learning about them, go out at night and try to look for them. And so with that, I just thank you guys for showing up and coming out here. And if you have any questions, we also got some ambassador animals here that feel free to take a look at. So, thank you guys.